Welcome to Author Life Podcast, where myself and guest authors share their stories, offer tips and advice, and share our writing, publishing, and marketing knowledge. I'm your host, Delcherie Gladden. Welcome back to the podcast this week. Today we're going to be talking about setting and the importance of setting, how it impacts a story, and how it impacts character development as well. So the first thing to think about with setting is that it's not just a location where characters are going to interact. Setting is very critical to a story's success for several reasons. First, setting really affects how a story progresses. Location can be a hindrance to the story or the character progression, or it can facilitate character development or story progression. If a character is taking a physical journey, setting can definitely be used to create physical obstacles, such as a hot desert with a long stretch of no services or fellow travelers when a vehicle breaks down. It can also provide an environment for success, such as a calm and peaceful park where a character can collect her thoughts after a stressful or traumatic moment. Setting can also affect a character's worldview and mindset. When, where, and how we grow up shapes us. Consider the differences in how two characters may think and act when one grew up on an organic farm and volunteered at a no-kill pet shelter, and another character grew up on a ranch where animals provided food and income, and nature was often seen as an enemy to survival. They're definitely going to view the world differently, maybe have different values and differences in how they perceive events around them. Setting also helps to establish the atmosphere of scenes and affects the reader's perception of events as well. So picture a character walking down the aisle of a bookstore. How does that experience differ when the shelves and books are nicely arranged, there's plenty of light, and there's cheery music playing in the background? And then compare that to if the store is dark and musty with scattered stacks of books everywhere, and the only sound is the character's footsteps, and maybe the sound of someone's footsteps following him just out of sight. Details of the setting can make all the difference in how an experience will be perceived both by the character and the reader. Setting also affects the character's choice and actions in certain situations. Depending on, how it impacts the scene or the story, the setting can alter or influence a character. If a character has a clear view of escape from a dangerous situation, she will most likely take it. If, however, her view is blocked by other people or objects in the way, the decision will take longer to make because she has to consider multiple options. So the possibility of a wrong decision or inaction increases and can provide a stumbling block or a barrier. Also consider how possibly a room filled with people all staring or waiting for an answer will provide more pressure to give in or lie, as opposed to a one-on-one meeting in a welcoming and bright office. Lastly, setting can also act as a character, either as an antagonist, such as in a survival situation, or as a protagonist, such as a garden that provides solace and comfort to an introverted person who fears the unknown. So it's really important to carefully consider the details of a setting and how it will impact the other elements of the story. So now let's talk about types of setting. There are two main types of settings that we're going to talk about: backdrop and integral. So with backdrop settings, they're not super important to the story. The scene utilizing a backdrop setting could take place almost anywhere without changing the general dynamic or meaning of the scene. These are often transition scenes where minimal information is exchanged or some detail or piece of information is revealed to the reader. These are settings like hallways, cafes, sidewalks maybe, an office. They allow for quick entry and exit and are often familiar settings to the reader, so they don't need a lot of description or attention to detail. Not having to spend page space on setting, description, or explanation allows the focus to stay on the content of that scene. Now with integral settings, these are settings where time and place influence the theme, character, and action of a story in some way. So for example, Animal Farm wouldn't be quite the same if it were set in a shoe store. And the way setting influences a scene should be somewhat obvious, in the sense that the characters being in the scene feels right to the reader, and the details of the setting help the reader more fully experience what's happening. These types of scenes need more in-depth description and development. So take the time to point out important details that bring the scene to life, such as maybe the cleanliness of the room, how dim or bright it is, does it feel oppressive or free, are there colors that reflect personality or tone? But don't get too carried away. Don't describe every single detail of the scene. Just make sure to point out those elements that are going to help the reader get to know the character better or interpret what's happening or what information is being given more fully. Integral settings are usually recurring settings or settings used for important scenes in the story. When these settings are first introduced, there will often be more detail and focus on how the setting affects the character or mood. This type of detail isn't necessary every time the characters visit the scene, but when needed, you can mention important details again. Or when you're using a scene again, you may also want to mention a detail that has changed, one that you think the reader may need to be reminded of because it will play an important part in some way. Or those details that the character may have missed or missed the significance of when the scene was used previously. Description of setting should most often be kept at a minimum. Give enough detail that you feel confident that the reader can form a basic mental image and let them fill in the blanks based on their own experiences. Trying hard to force the reader to create an exact mental picture of a setting is exhausting for the reader, and it will take up a lot of page space that you can better use with other details. So remember to evaluate what type of scene you're working with before adding description and details. Now we're going to dive a little deeper into the various elements of setting. So there are several major components you want to consider, especially with integral scenes, and most of these are at least somewhat interconnected as well. So it's important to consider all aspects of setting and how each element is going to impact the story and the characters. And many aspects of setting have the potential to affect both of those. So don't just look at how it's going to affect either character or setting. You want that to work in combination as well. So let's think about the social environment. The social environment that a character inhabits affects their place in society, how she views herself, and how others view her. It can impact confidence and expectations of that the character holds for himself or that others hold for him. A social environment can be encouraging and supportive, or destructive and hindering, or somewhere in between. It's also important to consider the stability or chaotic nature of a social environment. Instability may breed disillusionment and rebellion, while stability encourages things to stay as they are and may be either peaceful or boring. Next is place or location. So where a character lives or was raised will impact how she thinks and what she values. Consider how the land and nature has impacted her life, or how a lack of either may create a sense of fear or longing. Location also helps determine what hobbies, skills, or habits a character might develop. City dwelling requires different survival skills than country living, and classical ballet may not have been an option in a small rural town, while in cities there are more access to a variety of activities. Place is also important in determining what a character has learned to value. Aspects to consider here might include family bonds, responsibility or duty to the community, obedience to elders or leaders, respect for other cultures, that type of thing. Really just consider what has developed that specific place over time and how that is going to influence the character as well. And then think about what experience a particular place would have available that would influence developing values as well. Now, time also influences setting quite a bit. Time plays an integral part in creating an accurate and believable setting. This is, of course, easier when dealing with the modern world or a time period that the writer has personally experienced. When writing in a time period not modern or not personally experienced, it's really important to thoroughly research the technology, politics, fashion, slang, and speech styles, important historical events, and even differences in geography and town and city structures. So really dig into it and see which elements of the setting in that particular time period are going to influence the story or characters. Because every time period develops its own social and political culture that's created by a variety of factors. So become familiar with those factors in order to accurately portray a specific time period. This type of research is also important to know because it will impact the character. So certain concepts and ideas were not widespread or commonly understood in one period versus another. Also, some ideas, even freedoms and information, were simply unavailable in certain time periods and will affect how a character views his or herself or the world around them. Mood and atmosphere are also important to setting. Whether you're mimicking a real setting or creating a fictional one, mood and atmosphere need to be considered in order for the scene to connect with the reader in the way that you want it to. So determine what type of mood and atmosphere will best serve the scene, then break down what will help create the right mood and atmosphere. So factors here might include weather, decor, the time of day or night, sounds, the lighting, colors, whether it's a formal or informal environment, other people in the space, the topic of conversation, on and on. So really just, focus in on what, few details. We don't need to, again, go overboard, but find a few things that are going to help set the right mood and tone for that particular scene. Now, you also want to consider climate and geography. Weather and geography can influence both the storyline and the character's thoughts or actions. So when writing a scene, consider whether the climate and geography will help, hinder, or even remain neutral. It doesn't always have to be a factor, but if you are going to mention it, it should be for a reason. A neutral climate or geography will have little to no impact on the events or actions of the scene. So in this case, you can usually leave out those kind of details more than maybe just a passing mention of what season it is or something like that. A helping climate or geography will provide support and purpose to the scene, whether that be physical, emotional, or mental. Good weather and a pleasant geographical area can further deep thinking, romantic opportunity, or calm reflection. Bad weather or rough geography can also be a help if it pushes the story in a desired direction, such as seeking shelter together or providing strenuous activity to clear the mind. Now, a hindering climate or geography will frustrate a goal or action, though ultimately continue to advance the storyline still. A storm might knock out power when it's needed most, or a swampy landscape might make tracking a suspect slow or impossible. While actions or goals might be temporarily hindered, they should still provide opportunities for progression and growth for the character, as well as progression of the story. For the character, that might include, overcoming a fear or a physical limitation. Politics and culture are also really important to setting. A character's political views and cultural background greatly impact how he sees himself or the larger world. It is important to consider also how a town's or region's politics and culture intersect with the character's goals, decisions, relationships, career choices even. Some areas have strong and specific cultures, which are often intertwined with political ideals. Other areas have a more general culture or political temperament, so individual family culture and politics might play a bigger role in that character's development in that situation. Young minds are highly influenced, and the political and cultural environment a person grows up in helps to shape their personality and their worldview. So a major point of conflict in a story may revolve around overcoming closely held views as a person grows older, experiencing a new culture or political view, or even facing a personal crisis related to that. So make sure that you just fully explore these aspects of personality and character development in relation to the political and cultural parts of the setting, so you can create a deeper character that connects with readers on a more profound level. Now, with history of a location, you want to consider that on a personal, local, and macro level when developing your setting. A character's personal history with a setting can deeply affect how they view that location and may change some aspect about their personality when they're in that location, such as going home to an abusive environment. Towns or neighborhoods have specific histories as well, so don't forget to kind of zero in on that. How a neighborhood developed within a larger city might have to do with its ethnic or racial background, and may be more closely linked to career or trade as well. Natural disasters or community tragedies will also affect the culture and atmosphere of a place. On a larger scale, consider major events within society when developing setting. What changed about New York post 9/11 or elementary schools during the COVID-19 pandemic? What are some of the lingering effects still seen in New Orleans from Hurricane Katrina? How has the BLM movement changed the way some towns and neighborhoods interact with police or racial groups? These are some major events that you want to consider if you're writing in that time period. And some authors choose not to address such issues in order to avoid dating a story. But, especially now, I think that often proves impossible to completely ignore major political or cultural aspects like that. So just take it into account in whatever way it's going to affect your story. If a large-scale issue impacts setting, just make sure that you're thoroughly researching the issue in order to portray it and its effects realistically. Now, when it comes to social environment, this is an important aspect of setting because it can really make a difference on the development of the characters who impact that setting. So the social environment a person exists in affects his or her thoughts, actions, and decisions. Consider the following aspects and how they might influence the character that you're creating right now. So education. While an individual character's education level is important in developing her dialogue and way of speaking, it's also important to think about the general level of education that exists within a setting. Areas with lower education levels may rely more on a superstition or experience or generational knowledge. Areas with higher education levels may turn more toward academic knowledge, research, and expert opinions. And, those can, on either side, be a hindrance or a help. Education level can also affect choices, options, and modes of problem solving. With social structures, those that are in place within a setting, they can really affect the resources available to a character or to the community in general. Settings that lack strong social structures, such as access to healthcare or education, can be a source of struggle and limit options for characters. When effective and easy to access structures are in place, the setting may provide support and help instead. With societal institutions, they can have similar impacts as social structures that we just talked about, such as the presence or absence of social institutions can either help or hinder a character's options and choices. The 5 basic social institutions are family, economics, religion, education, and state. So consider how the presence or absence of each of those is going to affect a character, how they exist in that place, and how they move through the setting. Now, another aspect is social status or class. A character's social status will play an important part in their worldview, and as well as influence many other aspects of their personality and how they interact with the world. It's also important to think about the general social status or class of a setting and how that impacts the overall story. A setting that's predominantly high, low, or middle class will operate by a different set of rules than a setting that is more mixed. If there is a large divide between classes in your setting, there's potential for strife between classes, and movement between classes can also be a source of conflict. You also want to consider social circles. Social circles exist in every setting, no matter how big or small, but the impact they have on a story of the character, it can vary. Consider whether the social circles are fluid, stagnant, or restrictive within a setting. Whether or not a character belongs to a circle or is always separate or outside of a circle or desires to change the circles will affect how they exist in that setting. And lastly, there's social solidarity. So this is linked to the importance of social circles. The solidarity that exists within circles can affect a character or the story arc. A strong group of friends or family gives support and encouragement and may lead a character into occasional trouble. Friends and family who are flighty or unreliable may turn on a character or leave him stranded when they fail to follow through. Faith in social groups will allow the character to move more confidently in the setting, while perpetually questioning how much a character can count on others will make her more hesitant within the setting. So the next major aspect to consider is place and location. So place and location impacts a story by how characters interact with the setting and how it shapes their worldview. So you really want to go deeper than just city, suburbs, or country when locating your character within a fictional world. Consider both place and location. Place is a broader term that defines a space or an area, while location is a more specific point where an actual specific town, neighborhood, or building physically exists. So a place might be the mountains, while Emerald Lake near Estes Park, Colorado is a location. Place can also describe how a person lives within a space, such as an empty desert or an isolated cabin. Defining place in this way can help you establish how it will impact the story and the character's development and journey. For example, living in seclusion limits interactions with people, but it may shift a worldview to one more peaceful and patient. Living in a bustling city may give a character energy and enthusiasm to achieve a dream. Location can be used to create physical limitations and/or opportunities for a character as well. A character in search of an opportunity to share his art with others will have more opportunities in a city or town that values art and has a strong artist community. A character in search of a job outside of agriculture might face a great deal of frustration and disappointment in a small town that mainly relies on ranching for financial support if she is stuck there and can't explore other locations. The place and location should affect the story and characters differently depending on the situation. So consider how the same location of a small town with a close-knit community who has strong conservative values would have on a character coming home. A character coming home after a stint in prison for drug possession will be received and affected quite differently than a character who returns to announce their engagement and acceptance to law school. Location also has an effect on a character's thoughts and behavior. Walking into the 20th floor office on a first day on the job may inspire anxiety and cause him to make mistakes, while going out with friends for a fun night might inspire confidence and excitement. Interactions with other people change in different types of locations, and choices may even be very different. Hanging out with people a character has known all his life makes him feel comfortable and let down his guard, maybe to the point of revealing something he wouldn't or shouldn't tell anyone else. Meeting someone on vacation could lead a person to inflate their status or lie about certain aspects of their self or life because they believe they will never see the person again. So place and location almost act as another character in the way that they can influence both characters and story, so it is important to carefully consider both and use them to their full potential. So next you want to consider natural versus artificial environments. The physical type of environment a character exists in will determine what types of experiences he will have, what relationships to surroundings she may experience, and whether the environment is supportive or antagonistic toward goals. Each type has pluses and minuses. So artificial environments may grant access to advanced resources while creating a disconnect from nature. And natural environments can be plentiful and physically invigorating, but they're also unpredictable and unstable at times. You also want to consider deterministic versus nurturing environments. So settings can be constructed in a way that pushes a character toward a specific role or outcome, or it can encourage exploration and growth in a variety of directions. So deterministic environments often breed feelings of rebellion and mistrust of authority, while nurturing environments act as a resource for discovery and expansion. And next is personal networks. The networks of resources and support systems available to a character within a setting can have major effects on the story and the way the character exists in the setting. So limited networks offer minimal support, even if it contains one or two strong elements. And they are far outweighed by the elements that are not supportive or discourage change and growth. Personal networks may include family, friends, work or professional resources, education resources, healthcare, etc. And we talked about time period, but now just talking about time in general and how that can be incorporated into setting is also an important factor. You want to consider the different elements of how time impacts a setting, such as time and technology. So these two elements are really intricately connected because technology changes with time, and getting the pairing wrong creates anachronisms for the reader that they will most likely notice. A few may slip by, but in general, people are going to pick up on those. Technology can also impact the events of a story, such as being able or not able to contact someone easily by cell phone, or the ability to find needed information. When writing in your own time period, or the one you've lived through, it's easier to get the technology right, but anytime you venture from your own familiarity, really take the time to thoroughly research what was available in that time period. Not only is this going to help you create a more realistic setting, readers can develop respect for your hard work, and you'll increase your credibility when readers learn new things about a time period. So when writing crime, this is especially important because technology is critical to get right in order to be believable. Don't just consider when a technology was developed, but also when it became widely available in cities and rural areas, and the public perception of specific technology during that time. For example, DNA profiling became available in the early 80s, but it required a much larger blood sample than's needed today, and it was much more limited on what it could determine. And at times, it could also be more of a hindrance than a help in trials because so few members of the public understood what it was and either didn't understand it or distrusted it, even well into the 90s. And you also want to consider time and society. Now, time factors into self-perception and societal roles. Self-perception is all too often closely linked to how others treat a person. Throughout time, minority groups have been treated with varying degrees of respect and equality. So consider the experience of a 1950s Black woman applying for a professional job and how that would be different from a white teenage boy in modern times. Really consider, how they're treated, how that's perceived, how that's going to affect the character and the other people in the setting. The different ways that people experience life impacts how they see themselves and what trials and barriers they're going to face. Multiple studies have been conducted on how young Black and white children perceive beauty, goodness, and intelligence based on race, and the social environment they grow up in significantly affected how they saw themselves and others, and that's still true today. So create realistic social environments by studying how a particular time period affected those living it, especially those in particularly volatile areas. And lastly, you want to consider time and profession. Time period is going to limit opportunities for certain races, genders, religions, and other non-mainstream groups. So be sure to research historical rules, laws, prejudices, and even customs of a time period. Elizabeth Blackwell was a British physician and the first woman to receive her medical degree in the United States in 1849. However, it wasn't until the 1972 Title IX of the Higher Education Act prohibited federally funded schools from discriminating based on gender. So she was an exception, and using that as kind of your base for a story may or may not work, depending on how you integrate that. So be sure to do your research on the elements of time and profession surrounding the specific situation you want to use. Time should also be considered when it comes to sports, education, and careers. It's important to know how long it takes to become a lawyer, a professional athlete, business mogul, PhD, on, and plan your timeline and your ages of your character accordingly. I would really recommend trying to steer away from the genius or prodigy characters unless that's absolutely critical to the story. It's really become an overused trope that doesn't hold the appeal it once did. If you must have a 22-year-old billionaire, it's much more realistic that he or she inherited that wealth rather than that they built it on his or her own merit. So when writing in any time period other than the present, just don't forget to consider those other aspects like fashion trends, politics, generally available knowledge, and other important elements that are dependent on time as well. Next, you really want to consider mood, tone, and atmosphere. The setting can help determine the mood and atmosphere of a story, and these should vary throughout the story when the settings and other factors within a setting change. So first, let's go over the actual definitions of these three terms because they're really easy to confuse. So mood is the emotional feel of a scene. It's created through specific language meant to put the reader in a specific emotional state. Tone is the way the author expresses their attitude toward the setting and scene through their use of narrative devices such as description and vocabulary. And atmosphere is the combination of mood and tone, and it's created through the author's specific attitude or approach to writing the scene. So you really want to carefully consider the words that you use and the tempo of your sentences, even the point of view and perspective that you're going to write a scene from. And this also, ties back into description. So how a setting is described can change the way both the reader and the character perceives the scene and how characters interact with the setting. If the scene has a fearful element, characters will move through it more slowly and the reader will read more slowly so as not to miss anything. Description also helps to develop the tone of a scene. Use words that match the atmosphere you're trying to create. For example, a bird who chirps creates a different feel than one who squawks or caws. Textures, smell, and lighting can also be used to create a specific mood and tone. So really just make sure to use all 5 senses to develop your scenes and when you're considering how to describe it. Tone words are things like cheerful, nostalgic, melancholic, arrogant, things like that. Mood words should go beyond expressing feelings involved in the scene and describe movements, actions, even the decor. Really just consider where you can use those words to more accurately give the right feel. So consider the difference between the description of the covered bridge in Sleepy Hollow and how that feels in comparison to the Lovelock Bridge in Paris. A well-worn blanket suggests it's been used and cherished, while a threadbare blanket suggests maybe lack of funds or support. You also want to consider tempo when it comes to setting the right mood and tone. You want to match sentence tempo to what's happening in a scene. So you can use a quick tempo for an intense or frightening moment, using shorter sentences. You can also use high-impact words, such as like a single descriptor rather than a multi-word description. Limit your extraneous details, not absolutely needed. Stay focused on the action, and just try to avoid long sections of dialogues when you're trying to have a quick tempo. When you want a slower tempo scene, focus on longer and more fluid sentences for calm or contemplative moments. Description and internal dialogue can help slow down the pace when you want the reader or character to pay particular attention to something, or to give the reader time to process the scene more fully. Certain types of action can change the tempo of a scene as well. So fast or frantic movements create anxiety or a feeling of need. This can include things like searching for something, running, shifting, or even pacing. If, however, a character is engaged in slower movements, a calmer feeling will pervade the scene. So low-tempo actions might be things like reading, lying on a couch, strolling, folding your laundry, cooking, that sort of thing. Now, point of view can also affect tone and mood. So you want to consider which point of view will create the right feel for a scene. First person is very immediate and can cause emotions to feel more intense and immediate. First person also puts the reader in the middle of the action or emotion as it's happening. For romances or personal stories, this can help the reader feel like they're experiencing the story with the characters and create a strong atmosphere. However, first person can sometimes be too much for some topics or events, such as those that may have some triggering effects for some readers or just may be really overwhelming. First person can also be too limiting if the reader needs to know details happening around the character, but not necessarily within his view or awareness. The third person provides distance and a wider view of the events, but it has pluses and minuses as well. Third person typically allows for more thorough description because the character doesn't necessarily have to be physically taking note of the scene details in order to share them with the reader. It can also provide a buffer between the story and the reader when there are those difficult subjects or events that are being described. If the emotions or actions of a scene need to be close to the reader in order to get the right atmosphere, Third person can provide too much distance at time and possibly weaken the mood or tone. So it really depends on the situation. There will, of course, be different types of scenes throughout the story that might have conflicting point of view needs. So consider the story as a whole and determine which one is going to work best for the majority of the scenes, and then you have to kind of be flexible with other scenes. Now, coming back to climate and geography, it can really affect a character's life in a variety of ways, and making use of those impacts can help you create a fuller environment. So, climate. The most basic ways that climate affect a character is, adjusting everyday details like choices in clothing, what activities are available at that time, possibly thinking about adverse conditions and their feelings toward weather, or how that impacts their mood and the ability to spend time outdoors. On another level, climate can affect a character's worldview. For example, harsh climates often create harsh existences. Characters have to struggle against the elements for survival, as well as regular human problems. This can create physically and emotionally tough characters. Easier, softer environments may mean a character is less prepared for a harsh situation that's coming up, or has a more optimistic or positive outlook. And then, of course, climate is also going to affect the hobbies and skills a character might develop, as well as what opportunities or knowledge he or she may have. You won't find many year-round ice rinks in the hot southwestern United States, but in colder northern states, many children grow up playing hockey rather than soccer. So being vague about climate is not really a good substitute for research and planning, so don't just ignore it. Not only will you miss out on opportunities to create a character with more depth, your scenes may feel a little lackluster at times as well. Now, with geography, you really want to think about what part of the world a character inhabits and how that affects a variety of different setting aspects. The physical location will determine what types of plants and animals live in the area. It's hard to have an alligator as a means of disposing of a body in Idaho, but an all too real possibility in coastal Louisiana. Geography also affects characters' access to other areas, such as living in an isolated cabin in winter where the plows don't maintain the roads, or different types of ecosystems. Physical location will also determine what dialect a character uses, though you don't want to overdo it with using too many regionalisms or colloquialisms in dialogue. It's also important to consider whether a geographical location has pronounced or dug-in views on politics or religion, or maybe a unique culture or social structures that are not mainstream, and even whether or not a character will fall in line with those aspects of their locations or not. Researching these types of setting aspects also offers up great opportunities to make the setting more unique and memorable. And then also consider how man-made geography can impact the developing setting's geographical location. Dams, buildings, and monuments not only change the natural geography, but can influence how man's influence on nature is perceived in that area as well. So just take a little time to dig into the climate and geographical location of your setting to see what elements can be used to enhance the setting, characters, and story. And we also want to look at how you can integrate history into your setting. So the history of setting can be easily overlooked during development. Not thinking about it can create lost opportunities to enrich a story, though. The history of an area influences nearly all aspects of the society that exists there. Not only can the land itself change, it can be changed by other people or forces. So you want to consider major events like natural or man-made disasters, wars, significant political events, major religious movements, large-scale societal changes, and the physical history of a place. For example, much of the landscape of Europe was changed during the 2 World Wars, with some towns just completely ceasing to exist or being rebuilt after clearing the rubble. A centuries-old town suddenly made new could drastically change how people interact with the setting and with each other, and it can change the tone of the area and create sentiments of either hostility or hope. Parts of New Orleans and the surrounding areas still have some ruined or abandoned buildings destroyed by the 2005 Hurricane Katrina, and how that natural disaster was dealt with definitely impacted and changed many lives and attitudes in the area. Areas that have experienced unrest or turmoil may have physical markers of the struggle, events to commemorate it, or even an air of secrecy if it's a history the residents are not proud of. July 24th isn't a special day in most of the United States, but Utah hosts Pioneer Day celebrations that day to commemorate Mormon pioneers arriving in the valley. So there are also many events that spoof or mock Pioneer Day in the area, such as Pies and Beers Day or Pies and Queers Day in the area, which highlight the tension present in various parts of that state. Major historical events impact generations and can shape and alter the society of a specific area as well. So, especially with historical fiction, which requires a great deal of research, really don't leave out modern fiction and how you want to consider the history and how you can make use of such important historical influences. All aspects of life are influenced by the time period a person lives in. If a story has multi-generational characters, the history of a place can be a great way to show the effects of history on a place and its residents. Old biases and prejudices may be perplexing to younger people who didn't experience race riots or who only experience acceptance of LGBTQ persons today. Consider how each historical element affects daily life, worldview and self-perception, opportunities, and choices of your character. Work to weave in these influences into the overall storyline and into the character's backstory, current self, and motivations and goals for the future. So now we're going to dive a little bit more into world building. So with fictional settings, whether modern and real world or historical, sci-fi, fantasy, paranormal, all of these types of fictional settings are going to require some level of world building. Settings should transport the reader to a particular location and not feel like it could have taken place anywhere. To accomplish that, some level of world building is needed. Even in modern fiction, you want to consider some of these details. Details make all the difference in world building and keep a setting from feeling just really generic. World building should highlight the unique and quirky elements and integrate them into the storyline and your character profiles. Now, the amount of world building needed is going to definitely depend on the genre. So with realistic modern settings, they're not going to require as much world building, especially large-scale world building, because readers are going to be familiar with the current rules and concepts of the modern world. But it is still going to be needed on a smaller scale. So you really want to consider the mini-worlds that exist within a modern setting, such as the culture of an apartment building or workplace, or even the neighborhood. Each of these settings will have specific rules that guide interactions, a history that has helped develop its culture, an atmosphere linked to the people and the culture, and a character developed by its physical components. Each world-building element will then interact with the characters and the story, such as the tone of an office making a character feel either welcome or inspired, or fearful and anxious. You want to address the pertinent elements in description and exposition, or use dialogue between the characters to share thoughts and opinions on the mini-world and how it affects the characters. And don't expect the characters to just automatically understand a setting just because it exists in the modern world. James Pietragallo, co-host of Small Town Murder, mentioned on a podcast episode that he couldn't get into the TV series The Office because he had never worked in an office and didn't really understand the culture. So you want to take things like that into account when you're building your mini worlds. Now with historical settings, these are definitely going to require a lot more research, because with historical fiction, readers will definitely catch mistakes and will be put off by them. Research should be conducted on 2 levels at least: era accuracy to get the historical facts correct, and daily living accuracy to get the small details right as well. The most obvious elements to be researched for a historical setting are elements like clothing, socio-political events and impacts, transportation, technology, but many of these elements are often affected by less obvious research areas, such as available social services, laws regarding various aspects of life, how the justice system functioned, even healthcare and knowledge of diseases and treatments, and things in that realm. So Make sure that you're taking the time that if you're going to talk about something specific in a historical setting, research that specific topic and make sure you're getting it right. And before you start developing a historical storyline, consider how the time period will affect the events your characters will engage in. So female business owners were uncommon prior to the 1900s in many countries. And even then, the types of businesses women would own were often limited. If a female business owner married, business ownership could transfer to the husband in many situations, which could make a woman think twice about marrying. So just make sure that your storyline will actually work within the time period you've chosen by doing thorough research. Now with sci-fi, fantasy, and paranormal genres, there are different things to consider when world building your setting. Non-realistic settings offer the greatest opportunities for world building, really demanding creativity and organization. Whether you're working with futuristic machines, dark creatures, or mythological beings, it's important to develop an organized and functional world for them to inhabit. Research is still an important world-building technique for these types of worlds, but it's only one component. Depending on how closely you plan to follow established science, mythology, or folklore about the worlds and beings in a setting, research needed may vary. If you plan to vary from what is already established, it's a good idea to start at a common ground so readers have some familiarity before introducing new or different elements. The second component of non-realistic world building involves developing rules and structures. Even though these types of stories do not exist in the real world, they still need to be realistic enough that the reader can understand how it operates and by what rules characters make decisions or interact. And these rules should provide organization to the world and allow readers to make judgments and have expectations about character actions and choices of what may or may not happen. And once the rules and the structures are developed, they need to be followed in order to avoid confusing and frustrating the reader. And a lot of that is going to bleed into setting because the way characters are going to interact with the setting also needs to make sense to the reader within that world. So along with creating a non-realistic world that makes sense to the reader, you want the same types of world-building techniques needed in realistic settings. Those can be applied in order to develop the necessary mini-worlds or in communities and neighborhoods. So when you're working on creating a unique setting, writers can use these world-building techniques to really, flesh out and fully develop their scenes. First, you want to start with the basics. And there are some really good questions to consider when you're initially developing your setting. Think about the layout and the geography. Consider what lies beyond your immediate setting. How does your micro setting fit into the macro world? Also consider the politics, laws, and governing systems. Think about your cultures and traditions, weather, local plants and animals, what are job situations, economy, import and exports of the area, history, how that impacts enemies and allies, folklore and urban legends, and details only locals would know. And also consider the hero's feelings and opinions about the place. So these can be a really good starting point to start adding some uniqueness to your setting. All of these elements are also going to affect a character's views, their way of thinking, actions, choices, and lifestyle, and how those are going to impact on the story is something that you want to consider. Once you have at least one item for each element in the list, then you want to consider how each one might affect the character or story, and whether that effect is beneficial and moves the story forward, or if it simply adds another layer of richness. These elements can be integrated into a setting as minor and major elements, depending on what the scene needs. Folklore may be relevant in a non-realistic storyline about a child who's gone missing under mysterious circumstances, but only mentioned in passing in a realistic setting where adults reminisce about childhood fears. A mixture of major and minor elements can help give a setting depth and uniqueness. Once you have kind of your large-scale concept of how you're going to develop your unique setting, then you want to dive into working on the details a little bit more. Because details really do make a big difference in world building, whether it's high fantasy or the corner coffee shop. The level of detail often depends on the genre, So unless the color of every mug in a coffee shop is relevant to the story, that's usually a detail you can leave out. But you do want to develop an intricate system of, but if you're developing an intricate system of magical spell creations or introducing a non-realistic world to readers that they're not familiar with, you are going to want to go into a higher level of detail, explaining those systems and how things operate so the reader can better understand the process or the place. In either situation, though, details that you share with the reader need to be relevant, no matter the genre. Don't just add details for the sake of, filling out the scene and taking up space. So food is an example of how you can see something that's relatively simple and easy to overlook, but it can be an important detail in providing information about a character through using the setting. So what characters eat can indicate location, such as putting coleslaw on pulled pork sandwiches, which is a lot more common in the South, but perceived as a strange combination in maybe like the Southwest or the western part of the United States. Food can reveal information about income, such as a character having a cupboard full of ramen noodle packets or a collection of delicious wines in a built-in wine fridge. Food can also inform the reader about personality quirks. If all the food in a character's fridge is yellow, the reader is going to wonder why. Irrelevant details can have the potential of confusing readers because they cause them to look for hints and twists where there aren't any. So these can later appear to be plot holes or sloppy writing. So remember to keep in relevant details and cut those that aren't. There's that advice of if you mention a gun in scene 1, it better be fired by someone by the end of the story. So just kind of keep that in mind when you're adding in details, that they need to be relevant and important so that they're not distracting. And lastly, when you're developing your unique setting, you really want to think about how you can add layers to that setting. So once you have the foundation of the setting in the world, and you're starting to add in those details, you really want to do it in logical layers. Consider a real world building example. So you choose the city that's relevant to the storyline. Then you maybe choose a profession that makes sense for that location and the character. Then you're going to choose a neighborhood with access to amenities that will help progress the story. Then choose maybe one or two frequently visited locations that provide opportunities for conversation, action, or conflict. And then you can dive into developing the hobbies that allow for character growth and, keep progressing in that fashion. When building a paranormal world, that process is similar but may have some different aspects to consider. So you may start with choosing a mythology base, and then make some adjustments to tweak the base to suit your major plot points. Develop main powers and beasts that provide conflict between two or more groups. Then develop the main powers and beasts that provide conflict between two or more groups. Develop rules for those powers and beasts that keep winning from being too easy. Develop goals for each opposing group. Then develop individual goals that clash with others' goals in the group or the group's goals. And then develop individual power or beast uniqueness that needs to be developed as the story progresses and, continue on in that manner. Every genre, there's going to be a different path, but it still needs to be a logical progression in the world building so that every element added should impact the story and the character in a meaningful way. Another really important aspect of just developing setting in general is going back to show, don't tell. It's a very common piece of advice in creative writing in general, and I think it's especially important when it comes to setting. When you're explaining description, young or new writers often try to tell the reader too much about the environment that a character inhabits. And this often happens by giving one concrete detail of the setting, then explaining what that detail means, such as the sofa had a tear in the armrest, which had been there for years because Agnes's mother couldn't afford to buy a new one and never had enough time to attempt fixing it with her meager sewing skills. And that might sound fine at first glance, but there are better ways to share this information with the reader without being so wordy and direct. Consider what this piece of description is telling the reader. This family is not wealthy. The mother works a lot. The mother lacks traditional homemaking skills. And the house and its contents are worn and often in need of repair. To make description effective and well integrated into the story, you want to avoid big blocks of telling. It's important to consider how the character experiences the information if you're trying to communicate to the reader. It's important to consider how the character experiences the information that you're trying to communicate to the reader. So here's some examples of how this same information can be shown and integrated into the bigger story. Agnes collapsed onto the couch. She blindly reached across the arm of the couch in search of the remote, and her fingertip caught on the ever-present hole in the fabric. She frowned at it, just as her mother always did. Agnes wished her after-school job was enough to help her mother buy a new couch, but even with her measly paychecks, they were still barely covering the bills. The one time Agnes had suggested she quit school to work still made her shiver when she thought about it. Her mother's slap had been completely unexpected. She'd yelled that she wasn't working double shifts just so Agnes could end up just like her. A strange mixture of hurt and shame filled Agnes as the memory swept over her. She stared at the hole. Maybe she could fix it. She scoffed and shook her head. With what sewing skills? Her mom had been too busy working as a kid to learn things like that. So in this paragraph, the same information is given to the reader, but it's given through Agnes's thoughts and experiences rather being directly told to the reader. It's delivered over time at a more natural pace as well. And you really want to be a little wary of overindulging in description. Description should have a point. It should be relevant to the story and situation. Long passage of elaborate description may have been the style in past eras, but in today's world, readers have shortened attention spans because there are so many pressures on time. Building a detailed setting with endless description will bore most readers and may even cause them to abandon the book. So trim down long sections of description of setting to what's relevant to the scene and to what provides useful information to the reader. Description should orient the reader in the setting. Let them explore the setting with your character in a way that reveals insights about the character in his or her life, and what is important to the character as well. Consider how to reveal information about a family's dynamic through setting by having a teen maybe looking through the kitchen cupboards. If the sole box of cereal in the cupboard is on the verge of going stale, that reader will begin to question how fit the parents are, whether there is enough money to meet basic needs, or if there are issues of abuse or neglect taking place. You might present the opposite information to the reader by describing cupboards filled with healthy foods and ingredients and the character's favorite items. This will suggest at least, comfortable wealth, attentive and educated parents possibly, a caring environment, just a very different feel based on what is in the cupboards of this kitchen. So most likely your character will have a home life that's somewhere between these two extremes, but it only takes a few carefully crafted sentences to show that to the reader. So to wrap up our discussion of setting, you just really want to use setting to help readers get into the story and relate to it, rather than directly telling the readers just, the bare facts of where a story's happening and what it's like. Focus on how the characters experience that setting, what details of the setting are important to the story, and how you want the reader to experience that setting along with the characters. So hopefully these have been some helpful tips to help you create a more unique and thoughtful setting and be able to integrate that setting into your story more fully. As always, for more information on setting, for more craft articles on creative writing, you can visit my website, DelchereeGladden.com. If you have suggestions for future episode topics or ideas and writing tactics that you want to explore more, you can always reach out to me and let me know what those are. And I'm happy to add them to the list. Thank you for checking out the podcast this week, and we'll see you next time. Thanks again for listening to Author Life Podcast. For more information on the podcast or guest authors, check out the links in the show description. If there's a topic you'd like to learn more about, find me online and send me suggestions anytime.